a hush has fallen. That means we've got to begin. We're expecting Anne McAvoy to come and share us, but her taxi is waiting outside somewhere else at the moment. So I'm Richard Best. I'm an independent in the House of Lords and been associated with some of a good many of you. This is like a reunion actually today. It's great to see old friends here today. So we're going to hear about the Coalition's record. This is thanks to the Universities of Manchester, LSE, York, a bit from Essex, and many thanks to the three foundations who've made it possible. Nuffield Foundation, Trust for London and the JRF, my old stable. Thank you to all of them for making this possible. This is the second set of social policy in a cold climate papers on the Coalition's record. There are 9 papers included in the overview. This, one seminar, 9 reports. This is real value for money this morning. Fantastic. The first set of papers on Labour's record, the first lot were published in 2003 in July. This is the second lot, and we're going to have a presentation of them by Ruth Lupton, a coordinating author, and John Hills from Case. And this is going to take us about 25 minutes, and then we will have a response from Ryan Shorthouse and Kevin Kelly, and I'll introduce them after this first presentation. Great to see everybody, and let's get cracking. John, you're going to go first. Is that right? No, Ruth's going to go first. Ruth, please, we're in your hands.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. Thanks for stepping in at the last moment. So I'm not going to be allowed much time for preliminaries, so just 3 really quick ones. First of all, you've only got 8 reports and an overview on your chairs. Sorry about that. The 9th report is on schools, and we've deliberately held that back because the new GCSE results, which are a really important part of the story, come out tomorrow. So we didn't want to have to rewrite it all next week. So that will be out on the 10th of February. Second, I'd like to echo those thanks to the funders, the Nuffield Foundation, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and the Trust for London, for their continued support for this very large and important project. And the third thing to say is that although my name goes first and John and I are going to present this work, this is very much a team effort. And there are 10 authors on this paper, all of whom are here today and will help to, we'll talk to you about the specific papers in the breakout groups and help to answer questions here. So very much not my own work or John's own work. And also I'd just like to say thank you very much to our incredible support team, Bert Proven, Cheryl Connor and David Utting also, who's helped us to try and make this mass of evidence intelligible to a non-technical audience. So what's this monster project all about? Well, what we've aimed to do is to provide a thorough, well-balanced, well-evidenced record of the period from May 2010 to date, and projecting forward a little to inform the debates which will be happening in the next 100 days. You can judge our success in balance and evidence, but we've tried to stick very rigidly to this objective of producing a compendium of useful resources that people on any side of the debate can utilise. Secondly, just to say a little bit about the scope, we have not, although it's hard to avoid at times, we've not concentrated on macroeconomic questions or on questions about the management of public finances. We've taken those in a sense as given, and we've looked at the social policies that have ensued. There's lots and lots of exciting stuff that could be written about the politics of coalition. And in the papers themselves, you'll find information about what was in the manifestos, which of those things turned up in the coalition agreement and which of those things were subsequently done. But apart from stating those, we've said very little about the politics. We've tried to concentrate on the policies. We concentrate on UK policies where the policy isn't devolved, and where policy is devolved, we've concentrated mainly on England. And then a final thing to say is it's possibly an interim report. John will come back to this, because many policies haven't been fully implemented, and those that have, we can't always see the data yet. And our focus has been particularly on poverty, inequality, and the distribution of socioeconomic outcomes. And in this presentation, it's just a whistle-stop tour. We're just trying to tell you what's in there, so you can go away and read them. And for the detail in the specific policy areas, I'd really recommend that you go to the full reports and stay for the workshops later on. How should we understand the coalition? Firstly, a government committed to radical change. So one party been out of office for 13 years and the other given a rare chance to govern. So a government that wants to do things, has an agenda, but faced with a very unfavourable financial situation in the wake of the global financial crisis. So here you see through most of the 2000s the finances looking like they usually look, and then this big explosion in the national debt and the current budget deficit in 2008-9 and 2009-10. So a government faced with a financial situation it wasn't expecting, with a reform agenda already in place. So what we see, I think, is an accommodation, therefore, between not only between the agendas of the two parties, but between what they want to do and what they find themselves able to do. And this is evident very much in the government's own words from the coalition agreement. So the most urgent task facing the coalition is to tackle our record debts, they say. But fairness is at the heart of those decisions, so that those most in need are protected. So there's big statements up front about a progressive agenda. Deficit reduction, though, isn't what we came into politics to achieve. We've got our reform agenda, which is a Britain where social mobility is unlocked, where everyone, regardless of background, has the chance to rise as high as their talents and ambition allow them. And this will be achieved by sweeping reform of welfare, taxes, and most of all, our schools, with the breaking open of the state monopoly and extra money following the poorest pupils. The coalition says its core values are freedom, fairness and responsibility, and restating the reform theme overall, a radical reforming government, a stronger society, a smaller state, and power and responsibility in the hands of every citizen. So it's not a government that sees itself all about cuts by any means. And looking more closely at its aims, we can see this again. So just picking out some of the key aims from the different policy areas, the ones in purple, there are some big reforms here to simplify the benefits system, to reorganise the NHS, to establish the basis for funding long-term care in the future, to open up the school system to new providers, to reform FE and HE funding, to reform the work programme, to create the work programme, to form the welfare to work mechanism. So many large reform programmes, and at the same time, many statements also of its progressive intent. So make social justice reality, maintain the goal of ending child poverty, increase social mobility, emphasise the foundation years, tackle education inequality. So these two themes of reform and progressive intent. How does this pan out then? We think that a great deal of what happened next was framed by a number of key early decisions. The first one, announced at the spending review in 2010, was that 3/4 of the deficit reduction measures would come from public spending reductions rather than tax increases. And in fact, the government made room for some tax cuts, the rise in the income tax personal allowance from around about 6,500 to about 10,000 so far, and a reduction in the top tax rate from 50% to 45% from 2013. Pensions as well were to be protected by the triple lock, so they'd be uprated by whichever was higher of earnings growth, price inflation, or 2.5%. But other benefits not to be allowed the same protection. So these to be uprated by the lower, usually lower consumer prices index rather than earnings or retail prices, and then in fact uprated only by 1% for 3 years from April 2013, and a whole range of cuts and reforms to working age benefits, including housing benefits, disability benefits, tax credits, child benefit, income support, social funding and counter tax, and that isn't the whole list. So pensions protected but benefits not. And also some key services to be protected from spending cuts, namely the NHS, where there was a commitment to real terms increases in spendings, and also schools. So the first consequence of those decisions were that the direct tax benefit changes hit poorer groups more, in contrast to the government's stated intention, and also they made no contribution to deficit reduction. If you can see this graph, this is one that divides the population into 20ths by income along the bottom, so the poorer people are on the left and the rich people on the right, and it shows both what they lost below the line from different kinds of cuts and what they gained from increases in pensions or cuts in taxes. And the first thing to notice is that on the right-hand side, where we see the bar for all, the black dot, which is the net result of the gains to people and the losses, is at virtually zero. So overall, what the poorer people lost from benefits was entirely offset by what the better off people gained from tax reductions. So we're having no effect on deficit reduction. And the other thing you can see is that it is the poorer half of the graph that are the net losers, where on the whole, apart from the very top, the better off people are the net gainers. So that's the first consequence of those early decisions. The second one is that the scope for major savings was quite limited, because the areas that were protected are in fact the larger areas of public spending. I'm not going into the detail of this graph, but pensions is about half of working pensions, which is itself nearly a quarter of public spending. The NHS 17%. So by the time you've taken all of that lot out, there's only around about a third of public spending to play with. So that meant that while we see protection in some areas, we had to be sweeping cuts in other areas if any savings were to be made. That doesn't mean that nothing happens in the protected areas. In fact, the two major protected service areas, health and schools, have both seen major reforms, which I'm not going to go through in detail here, but major structural reform of the health service and an overhaul really of the state school system, with the academies, expansion of the academies programme, but also reform to curriculum assessment at every level, from 5 upwards. But they haven't been wholly protected relative to changes in need. So although health spending has increased, the annual growth rates have been considerably lower than we've been used to in recent times. And as we've seen in the media recently, there are increasing pressures on access and quality, so falls in the proportion of patients seen within 18 weeks of GP referral, so on, and hospitals struggling to meet their A&E waiting time targets. So although health has been protected, it has had a fairly limited protection. Schools are a different story. The protection here, in terms of spending, broadly keeps up with the growth in pupil numbers, although in primary, where the numbers are really growing, class sizes have risen and now at their highest since 2000. But on the other hand, in secondary, they're the lowest for nearly 15 years. So schools does see some real protection, health struggling more. But the axe really fell on the unprotected areas. So the net result of those early decisions and the protection of health, schools and pensions is that overall public spending was down only 3% to 2013-14, which is a surprise perhaps, given the rhetoric of austerity and cuts. But within that, local government in general down around about a third, Sure Start funding cut by 32%, adult skills down by 26%, and housing and community amenities, which includes money for building social housing, down 36%. So major cuts in the areas which weren't offered protection. And we show through our analysis the effects on services in those areas. So about a 17% cut in the number of Sure Start centres, although we actually find that services are holding up fairly well in the face of that, but partly through greater targeting. 17% fall in the number of funded adult learners, 27% fewer homes completed, and all the major funds for neighbourhood renewal cut entirely, with marked effect in those neighbourhoods. So while we see this shape of things that were saved and things that were cut, in reality, of course, these different spending areas are intertwined in people's lives. So obviously cuts to social care do create risks for A&E demand, for the length of time before people can go home from hospital, and also for the potential for raising the minimum wage, while cuts to family income and early childhood services are likely to put greater pressures and costs on services for older children. And I think, we can't really see yet the extent of these linkages, or the way in which one something lever being pulled over here will have an effect over here. But I think what we would say is that the decisive decisions made early on haven't really enabled a strategic kind of life course approach to the government's social policy objectives, but we can't yet tell how that will pan out. And just coming back to this point, that this is not all about cuts. And in fact, I think that what we see on this slide will probably be more what this government is remembered for in the long run than what we saw on the last one. So major reforms in many areas, both protected and unprotected, F&HE finance, the introduction of universal credit, possibly the biggest of them all, the work programme, some reforms to apprenticeships and vocational qualifications, which many people in that sector regard as going in the right direction, bringing us closer to European systems, tighter eligibility and greater conditionality and sanction across many benefits, really reshaping the relationship between people and the state. More new system funding long-term care, major reforms to the planning system, and reforms to state and private pensions. And so an enormous agenda of reform in just 5 years. And we pulled out three key themes here, although one is more provision by non-state bodies. We've tended to resist the words privatisation and marketisation, but people might read these differently. Localism and a redefinition of the terms for state support from the introduction, the much greater burden onto students and graduates paying for higher education, to these points about conditionality and sanctions around benefits. These don't apply consistently in all areas, and we've tried to pull that out, which of these themes have been most prominent in the different policy areas. But so really not just a government of cuts. And so to summarise what's happened, first of all, perhaps less austerity than the rhetoric has suggested, and therefore less impact on the public finances than the rhetoric has suggested. We don't think that the government's delivered on its promise to protect the poor, and it's cut selectively in ways that don't overall promise greater social mobility, and in some cases, although this isn't yet demonstrated, prove to be false economies. And it's been a very ambitious government in many respects, with major reforms, both the structure of the welfare state and the design and content of many service areas. So that's what we conclude has been done, and John is now going to tell us the result of that in terms of outputs and outcomes.
I thought you actually asked me to add some qualifications to that in some ways. So the first headline here is, which I think is very important, but is the kind of headline that is deeply disappointing from anybody from the media who would like to have a definitive answer, and is also deeply worrying for any of the funders in the room, because the obvious implication that it's too early to tell is that we'd like to come back in a couple of years' time and give a more definitive answer. And that's a serious point. We produced our assessment of the social policy record of the Labour government in the summer of 2013, so that was 3 years after it finished, was by the time all the data had come in and you could actually make an assessment, and it is literally too early to tell. A lot of the key data that we're interested in are only available to 2012 or 2012-13, sometimes 2013. And that's important because of this time sequencing of a lot of what's happened. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And of course, in most of the areas we're talking about, there's a time lag between policy changing and anything actually changing in people's lives. And in some cases, that's a very long time lag when you're thinking about things like social mobility, where we don't really even know the long-run effects of the last government on social mobility yet. And there are some things we can do, so there are some things that can be done where there's a quick and relatively straightforward relationship between policy change and outcomes, for instance, if income tax rates or allowances are changed, or if there's administrative data of one kind or another that can help. So that's one, I think, caveat. A second, I think, is just to reinforce the way in which the effects we can see or which we can model have been mixed. So that if you look at effects of what's happened to the budget, in this case I'll be saying more about this in the breakout session, what's happened to the Social Security and tax credit budget, what we describe as cash transfers, there has been a very clear shift in the balance of spending. And if you look back over starting from, I'm sorry, I was hoping for a larger screen, the top diagram there, which is showing public spending as a share of GDP, it was the bit at the top, the lighter bit at the top, which are pensioners, which grew most under Labour, plus the second bit, which are transfers related to having children. And then in 2009-10 is the third bar along at the end of Labour. Pensioners have maintained, spending on pensioners has maintained its share of GDP, but that's not been the case for transfers related to children. Still less has it been the case for transfers for the rest of the working age population, which have continued to fall as a share of national income, as indeed they did under most of the Labour period. When you look at the distribution of the direct tax, only direct tax changes, so income tax and national insurance and benefit changes, done on a slightly different basis from the diagram you just saw a moment ago. If you just follow the black line here, this is by age, and I think the point to note here is that relative to if things are kept up with earnings in this case, it's only at the bottom age groups, 0 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, that you see a loss compared with things not being cut in the way that real earnings were falling. So there's a clear age change has been going on, and the big break from what Labour was doing, I think, was the shift against families with children, not just the rest of the working age population, particularly, as Kitty Stewart will be talking about later on, the youngest children. But there are things going in the other direction, for instance, the pupil premium. This is far too small for you to see. What I'll just say is, I think I'll just talk about this more in the next session, that there's a very decisive change in tax and benefit policy, or in benefit policy, after April 2013. A lot of the big changes come in from April 2013. The numbers we have from the Institute for Fiscal Studies and DWP on poverty and inequality will be published in June, about a month or so after the election, I assume. And those will be the first figures that begin to take account of the effects of many of those most important changes, but those effects themselves are cumulative. And if you look at the projections, this is the Institute for Fiscal Studies modelling of what will have happened after 2012-13, looking all the way forward to 2020, which is the date of the child poverty target. Those modelling projections suggest a rise of 3.5 percentage points in child poverty, but it's just modelling. Sorry, Paul, but it can be wrong. And indeed, again, sorry, Paul, even looking a year ahead, one can be wrong, as an earlier version of these numbers were. So we don't know. We'll know a lot more in June. But for a lot of people in the room, that will be slightly too late. But come back in 3 years' time, and we'll be able to talk about what really happened. The other thing I think I need to say, really, as part of finishing off, is it is a mixed picture. I think we'd expect that, but I think it's worth reinforcing that. We're not talking about a uniform picture of austerity and problems in all directions. And some things maybe did not turn out the way that the gloomiest forecast would have been. So university fees rose to £9,000 from 3,500. But actually, university participation has carried on going up, and if anything, the socioeconomic gap, the huge socioeconomic gap in entry to university has narrowed a bit. The rate at which the young people are not in education, employment and training has actually fallen. I think if people were looking forward from the scale of the recession, what's happened to employment and unemployment rates, I'll come back to the qualification of that in a moment, is a much better picture than I think many people were expecting a few years ago. And although we've talked a lot about the very large, and Polly Vizard and Tanya Burkhardt will be talking later about what's happened to social care, and the drop in services in the face of rising need, you do see some positive outcomes for those who continue to receive services. So again, that's not just uniformly bad. And up until 2013, but watch this space and watch out for Ruth's report in 2 weeks' time, is it? Taking account of the detail we'll get on GCSE results. But up until 2013, under the old method of counting GCSE results, things were going okay. But there is a gloomy list of other things. Rising numbers of children needing protection, no narrowing, or these things change very slowly, in the socioeconomic gaps in child development. Very interesting looking at some of the detail of this, that if you haven't got qualifications by the age of 16 or 17, there's been a drop in people getting qualifications in the next group on. Homelessness acceptances up 26%. We know about the pressures in the housing market. I think very importantly, again we'll be talking about it more after the break, the increasing unmet care needs, which means either literally unmet care needs, people who have needs that are being met, not being met, or it means an increased burden on informal carers, and that's changing very rapidly. When we look at the detail on what's happening in neighbourhoods, where I think Ruth will be talking later about the lack of neighbourhood policy under the coalition, almost deliberate lack of neighbourhood policy, the gaps between poorer and richer neighbourhoods grew during the recession. They are now turning around, but are not back to where they were. And then you see some disturbing trends in things like suicide rates and so on. And although I said at the beginning that of the slide that on the previous slide that university entrance had held up, that is not true for mature students. So there appears to be less of a second route back, both between 16 and 19 and later. And then, of course, the other side of the labour market is things to do with what's happened to real wages, which, of course, drive, and we'll be saying a lot more about that, and how that's fallen in another report we'll be producing in the middle of March, unfortunately, because it's got to be written. But that's the other side of the context. Yes, employment has held up. A lot of that, and Abigail McKnight will be talking more about that after the break, a lot of that self-employment, a lot of that quite marginal, that has changed. So, for whoever, could mean quite a large constellation of people win the election in May, or many combinations of them, there will be huge challenges that both remain and some of which have intensified. So clearly, despite the protection of the health budget, there are, every day we know about the rising pressures on the NHS, and again, our work on what's happened to health spending and health activity in relation to need demonstrates why those pressures are so clear. Social care, even clearer, unprotected area, part of local government. Child poverty has been fell a great deal under the last government, not as much as its ambitions, but the modelling that we've seen both ourselves and from the Institute for Fiscal Studies suggests that child poverty will rise, and as the Social Mobility and Child Poverty Commission said just before Christmas, there is essentially no way that the statutory targets for, quote, sort of abolition, but reduction of child poverty can be met by 2020, and the effects of policy are currently going in the opposite direction. Whoever inherits the economy, the structure of the labour market with the growth of more marginal, more precarious employment of one kind or another, including what is labelled as self-employment, but is often anything but, and low wages, is clearly central to a lot of the debate that lies behind the position we're looking at. If you don't make it, while university entrance is going okay, if you don't make it to university, we're worried about the progression routes there. I think Becky Tunstall's going to be talking later about what's going on in housing, but I'm sure everybody in the room understands the problems there. And then continuing problems, not new, of lack of high-quality childcare, and what is more true now than was before, I think, a regionally unbalanced economy. So the inheritance, I think, of the next government on the social front will be less rosy, in fact, than the inheritance of the coalition on that front. And all of this will continue to be in the context of debt that is a higher percentage of GDP than it was at the beginning of the coalition's life, and what remains a high deficit. So I know some people in the US are currently in trouble for having overstated the scale of the blizzard that was going to hit New York. I think when 3 years ago we chose to call this programme Social Policy in a Cold Climate, we got it right. It has been a cold climate. The ice has frozen in different ways in different places, but we think that climate will continue and will form one of the major challenges for any incoming government. Thank you.
Wasn't that absolutely brilliant? Encapsulated in 25, 30 minutes. Thank you both very much indeed. Confirming that the next election is the election to lose. I think the only, picking up on that the deficit reduction hasn't really happened, but the poor are the people who have been hit most by the measures that have been taken. Taking this overarching view, I know exactly what the reaction of government is going to be. It is that everything has changed in the last 12 months. This will be we've got to be ready for that because data is always a year behind. It is really irritating. But the housing and homelessness ones that are my subject, whenever I get up and say something in the House of Lords, it's yes, but it's all changed now, which is an infuriating response. But it is the one that we will for sure get. Thank you two, very much indeed for that terrific overview. So now we come to some responses, and we have with us Ryan Shorthouse, director of Bright Blue, a very well-known broadcaster, commentator, and then Gavin Kelly, chief executive of the Resolution Foundation. Resolution Foundation coming from almost nowhere, and now a really significant think tank, a really helpful part of the think tank world. So, Ryan, could I ask you to respond first to that overview?
Great, thank you very much. And to say, congratulations on a very comprehensive report. So comprehensive, in fact, that I haven't managed to read all of it. So in my critique, if I say something and you say, aha, it's on paragraph 5 of Working Paper 67, page number 54, then I do apologise for that. And despite the reports in the newspapers, which predictably focused on the negative aspects of criticism of the government, I do think it is a fair assessment and has tried to be as balanced as possible. Indeed, I noticed things, for example, on Sure Start, that though there has been a reduction in the number, there's been a cut in funding, there's evidence to suggest that there's been a maintenance, indeed in some cases an increase in services across the majority of Sure Start centres. In higher education, of course, despite the rise in tuition fees, participation rates for the most disadvantaged have gone up. And also the fall in unemployment, peak employment, and particularly the reduction in NEET-DUM and youth unemployment from 16 to 24, which I think are real achievements of the government, and it's good to see that the report has focused on that. I think there are some areas where some of the positives could have been better reflected. So, for example, on childcare, there was talk about the number of places, and that has increased, the number of people taking up the free entitlement, 3 to 4 year olds, but now the most disadvantaged 2-year-olds. That's increased as well, but I thought the report focused very much on the fall in childcare places in children's centres, which only form a very small minority of overall childcare places. And actually, I think it's good to see this sort of heavyweight, comprehensive report, because usually it's the economy and the economic policy where we see these sort of heavyweight reports, particularly from the IFS, particularly on the fiscal and distributional impact of government reform. So it's good to see an attempt to have an overview of social policy. And frankly, as we know, the economy is dominating public discourse. Rightly, of course, but I think the Prime Minister's passion, certainly when he became leader of the Conservative Party, was very much on social reform and improving schools and, of course, what's not often talked about anymore, the big society. And this government has done a lot to change society, so around social mobility, public service reform, decentralisation of power, and ending dependency. So there's a real drive there. So it hasn't just been about cutting the deficit. And as a lot of people in the Tory party have long argued, and this is a political point, which is, I think, the Tories do need to focus on social policy. David Willetts talked about the importance of civic conservatism, not so the Tory party is just focused on dry economics, which is crucial for the electoral success of the Tory party, of showing that the party is not just a party of corporatism, but also of community. So no doubt a lot of Tory strategists in number 10 will be looking at this report and looking at the assessment that is made of something they're very passionate about. I want to focus very briefly just on one area, which is the effect on financial poverty, where the data is up to date and robust. And it's very clear, of course, that as a result of tax and benefit changes, people at the very lower end of the income spectrum have suffered most. So there's a class issue, but there's also an intergenerational issue, which is people who are over 60, older people, have been better protected than people lower who are younger, particularly families with children. And that is very clear. I would say that I think the government has had a choice about where the axe has fallen. And I think it went too far on reducing the value of benefits, especially in-work benefits, after 2013, which John mentioned. The choice was there because, of course, they protected things like free TV licences and bus passes and winter fuel allowance for the elderly. So although TINA, there is no alternative, is often employed as an argument for the cuts to welfare, I think there were choices. And indeed, the government's increased the personal tax allowance. It's now introducing transferable tax allowance for married couples. So there are, of course, choices, and I think the government went too far on welfare cuts. And even now, I think, as we approach the second part of deficit reduction, there is a big focus, particularly from the Conservatives, on cutting welfare expenditure with, as we saw yesterday, promise of bringing the benefits cap down and putting a cap on DWP's AMI expenditure, annual managed expenditure. I think, firstly, I don't think there's an insatiable appetite from the public for endlessly cutting welfare, and I think the evidence from the BSA suggests there is a little bit of bounce back there in terms of people being worried about the effects on poverty. And as our work shows as well, the public, particularly Conservative voters, are, they want a welfare system which isn't just slimmer, but also is fair, has contributory-based elements to it, is about something for something. And I think the scepticism that exists of state welfare, which is at an all-time high, as we know, is not just about mistrust of claimants. It's also the feeling that I've paid into the system, and when I need the system, I don't get the adequate support and I'm not suitably rewarded. So I think we do need to look at, in terms of welfare reform 2.0, beyond universal credit, how we can strengthen the contributory principle. So let me just focus now briefly on some sort of criticisms that I have of the report very, very quickly. First, because it's so ambitious and it tries to cover most areas, which I think it does successfully in most parts, there is a danger of missing out on some policies. So the overall record is not assessed. So, for example, there wasn't much discussion about the government's efforts on catalysing and nurturing social investment market and SIBs. And this is where private finance funds investments that yield economic and social returns. And in the case of social impact bonds, a return if any government savings from those finance projects arise. And the government has put money into that in terms of, for example, tax relief for social investment, and then looking at how you can support investees, charities, social investment projects. There's investment. There's the Investor Readiness Fund, for example. So, I didn't see in the report any mention of that, and I think that is a critical area of social policy. And then equally, just when we're reflecting, for example, on early years expenditure, what was chosen and what's not. So obviously there was a focus on Sure Start expenditure and childcare, but why, for example, was Troubled Families Programme, the spending there, parenting vouchers, why were those things not chosen? And I'd be interested genuinely to find out why that was the case. And of course, you can sometimes miss out on the nuance of the winners and losers of certain reforms if you just focus on total spending. So, for example, on early years, again, on a per capita basis overall, it seems that on average people have lost. But then again, some parents don't use Sure Start, and some parents have 2-year-old children, and they've definitely been a winner because the free entitlement has been extended to them. So in cash terms, they have been a winner, whereas, for example, people who use Sure Start may not have been. And then another criticism I would have is that, and of course, there are limits to what you can do in a report, but it misses some of the future things that this government has enacted in this Parliament, which will come into play in 2015 or beyond. So, for example, childcare support will be going up to 85% of costs. It went down from 80% to 70%, but under universal credit, it will be going up. And, of course, parents will be getting 20% of their costs covered, middle-income parents, high-income parents, through childcare support. And also with HE, the cap is going on the number of university places, and that will disproportionately benefit students from lower income backgrounds who have lower grades. There'll be more possibility of them going to university. So that's just to say there are some things which have been enacted now, which are coming, which perhaps needed mentioning. And then I would also say that on spending, it is, of course, an important part of the mix. It's crucial. But often, we can't fixate on that. And I say that for two reasons. First, there's often no correlation between higher spending in some services and improved outcomes. Certainly in education, the OECD has found that reform is critical there. And secondly, as those of us who are interested in social policy continuously argue, there's more to life than money. That's not to deny that cash transfers are, of course, important, and financial transfers are important, but it's also capturing well-being, control, and, of course, a sense of control. And, of course, we know from the ONS that they're now charting levels of well-being. And, of course, I don't think the report mentioned that. It instead focused on levels of depression and mental health rather than overall well-being, and there is a data set there. And, of course, it also misses out on things which affect outcomes, which government doesn't do. So things like relationship with family and friends, social capital, connections, the support, the practical and financial support you get from friends, families and neighbours. Of course, those things are often in survey like British Household Panel Survey and things like that. So the data won't be coming available till later. But that's just to say that what government does is not the only thing that that affects social policy outcomes, and you have to see it in the round and look at those other things as well. Okay. Just finally, if I can, if I'm not running out of time, is just what I think are the big things that are coming, and I'll say them very briefly. I was very interested in the discussion about NHS funding and satisfaction levels going down. I think we have to think much more imaginatively about how we can keep a free at the point of use NHS while resources are dwindling. Secondly, the persistence of low pay, which is a particular problem in the UK, and the connection that has with educational outcomes. And we must do much more to strengthen the vocational route, particularly on apprenticeships, making sure they're high quality. The focus has been on increasing the number of apprenticeships, but the focus now probably needs to be on making sure that quality is invested there as well. Poverty is rising. We need to look at alternative ways, particularly as the cold climate will continue, of tackling poverty. It's not just about the state. How can we have the market and families and communities helping? And then finally, we need to look at alternative ways just to state spending. For example, student tuition fee loans, that's an alternative way of using the state to finance social policy interventions. Can that be expanded? Are there other ways other than just direct cash transfers? And then final point, which is I was particularly interested about the cuts to for families with very young children under the age of 1. And I think there is a lot more to do from social policy makers like Gavin and I to focus on how we can strengthen, for example, the support people get through maternity leave and paternity leave. And I think childcare has definitely been a big focus of the government over the last 5 years. But I think there needs to be much more focus on that first year of infancy now and how we can support parents in that crucial year. So thank you very much.
Ryan, thank you very much. Lots of important points, really helpful. Gavin.
Thank you, Richard. Is this working? Yeah. Thank you for having me along. Well done, all of you, John, Ruth and others. It's a public service bringing all this together. It really is. Meant that genuinely. It's a lot of material. A lot of it's sort of familiar, but actually bringing it together in one place with this level of authority and kind of it's very forensic is a great service to the likes of me, but many other people. So thank you. Also impressive that you managed to do a presentation with 10 academics' names on the front, which was kind of coherent and came across as a seamless thing. I say that as someone who spent years in academia before you shout at me. So well done for that too. I mean, the headlines, which obviously don't capture, as Ryan says, don't capture the full story, but the headline of some very big shifts in our society and some big transfers, if you like, overall kind of fiscally neutral, as Ruth was emphasising, but fiscally neutral transfers between kind of worse off to better off, between old and young, between those with kids and those without, are major shifts in our country. I think we'll be living with and figuring out the consequences of them well beyond the next Parliament. And they're profoundly important. And as I say, we sort of knew some of that, but this report brings it out very, very clearly. I think the only thing I'd say on that is, if anything, it underplayed the context for those policy shifts. You know, if you just look at the kind of what's happened to young people, I mean, and people know this, but it bears repetition that the collapse, and I mean that word, the collapse in wages over the last 10 or 15 years of people under the age of 25, obviously a new cohort of people, is profound, and you can't really get your head around what's happened to how the tax and benefit system treats that age group if you're not also thinking about quite how severely the labour market has changed for young people, which I know is something that people are looking at in other reports, as John said. Now, I've only got a few minutes. Rather than give you my list of things I would have liked to have seen a bit more of or a bit less of, or my whatever else, I'm going to do something quite different, and I'm going to speculate a bit. I'm going to bounce off the report to speculate about the next Parliament, in part because it's incredibly important, in part because I haven't read every page of the report, so bear with me. And I want to really just sort of touch on two things. One is money, or lack of, and what that means for the nature of cuts and the nature of the debate on tax that I think we might be in store for. I have no idea, I'm making this up, but I'm giving you my hunch. And secondly, I want to say a few words about, it's a horrible phrase, but the fitness kind of for purpose of our social policy plumbing. Where are the big, how equipped is our social policy wiring in a number of different areas for what will be a very cold climate, to sort of mix metaphors. On cuts to come, we all know it's going to be a very, very tough Parliament. We also, I think, all know that depending on who's in power, there are very real differences between the parties, so it won't be the same. It could be quite different, but I think the range goes between very, very tough and, for me, sort of completely implausible. That's sort of a spectrum we're in, so we can feel safe in being worried, even if we don't quite know how worried. In terms of what that means, well, I think in terms of welfare cuts, I mean, again, most people in this room probably know it, but most of the obvious Whitehall wheezes, if you like, of which were served up under the last government, never mind in this current Parliament, for saving money through social security, kind of the RPI sweep, CPI switch and all that sort of stuff, which saves a lot of money, they've been done. And kind of up-rating by less and freezes and so on, that haven't been done for the whole Parliament, but there's been a lot of that is already baked into the numbers. So that kind of means that I think there will be a fairly decisive switch towards more of the savings coming from just straightforward restrictions and eligibility. You're just not eligible for something anymore, or cash cuts to benefits. In terms of the social security savings, I think the kind of the scope for the other sort of stuff we've seen has been significantly removed because of what's happened in the current Parliament. Now, quite how far that goes depends, obviously, on the other side of the equation, which is what happens on tax. I mean, the one thing I'll say with a degree of certainty is that you can ignore everything you're going to hear in the next 100 days on tax. In fact, you must ignore everything you hear on tax in the next 100 days. None of it will be true. Taxes will go up. The question is by how much and so on. Whoever wins the election, in my view. But you can say that a bit glibly, and I just did. And the question is, how much contribution do I think it's politically likely that taxes will make to this problem? And that's a tough one, because in some respects it's much harder than 2010. We've had 5 years of falling living standards. It's a harder political context to be jacking up taxes than it was. On the other hand, the economy is growing in a way that it wasn't, so economically it might be a bit easier. My guess is, I think it's very unlikely that anyone's going to put VAT above 20%. I see no one touching the basic rate of tax. So I'm kind of gloomy about higher tax rates raising big sums of money. I'm sure there'll be some changes in taxes at the top and so on. But in terms of serious money, I'm quite gloomy about higher tax rates. I don't see that coming, although national insurance is always kind of, the coalition raised national insurance in 2010, and they raised a lot of money from it, and they got almost no flack for it, so it's possible. I hope that doesn't happen. It's a really bad way of raising revenue, if you ask me. So I'm kind of gloomy about higher tax rates. I think there will have to be a bigger tax contribution. Therefore, I think, and this is a hunch, we're in for more of a reckoning about the tax relief part of our tax system. Now, you might think that's a good thing, or you might think that's a bad thing, but I predict it will be a thing. We spend 30-odd billion on pension tax relief. We spend 5 billion for landlords through mortgage interest rate relief. We spend 5 billion through reductions in corporation tax for training, which we don't know what we get back in return. I could go on. There's a lot, that serious money we're talking about, and it's largely unscrutinised money. It won't be easy money to pluck, but it is out there. And in a world where tax rates, I don't think, are going to do very much, that is something which I think will be a growth industry in terms of social policy inquiry over the next few years. So I think we're in for a very tough time. I think tax will have to do something, but I'm a bit gloomy about how much tax contribution will be made to the remaining problem. In my last few minutes, I want to switch to talk about the plumbing, the social policy plumbing. And this is less, in part of this reflects on the record of the current coalition, although some of the comments actually are very much about predate the coalition. It's a mixture, so this isn't really a set of judgments on them. It's more just a set of judgments about the areas where I'm worried about how prepared we are to get the right policies in the next Parliament, whoever wins the election, or more accurately, whoever loses by less, I think is probably the best way of putting it. I mean, obviously, we've got universal credit, which is the big bit of wiring, if you like, coming into the system, which is impossible, I think, we're doing lots of work on universal credit and what we would do to it. But I think it's very hard to say anything sensible about how robust it is, because it doesn't obviously really exist at any scale just now. It will be the biggest change in plumbing if it is to happen. I think it's still quite a significant if, but assuming it is to happen, That will be the biggest single change. The other thing, areas I would just touch on, and I'll just do it very briefly, the personal tax allowance. The personal tax allowance isn't just a tax policy, although it is. It's become a kind of emblematic part of our social policy infrastructure. It's the key mechanism at the moment, and could well be the next Parliament, through which the state seeks to engineer transfers in cash across households. I worry about that because it's blind to family form, it's increasingly regressive, 5 million people earn less than the personal tax allowance and so on. But it's a big deal in terms of how the government of the day and how Whitehall is thinking about how it does social policy, not just how it does tax cuts. If you look at cash transfers to families with children, we will be in a world where we have two means-tested ways of getting cash to families. They're highly overlapping. No one would ever have designed for a system like this, but no one is proposing to change it at the moment. That's the big deal. In relation to childcare, in the name of simplification, we have two demand-side funding streams. We have a complex supply-side funding stream. They don't fit very well together. Again, we probably wouldn't have started from here. In health, we have the well-known entrenched divisions between social care and healthcare funding, which I think lead to all sorts of pathologies and will increase public spending overall on the healthcare economy over the next Parliament. In schools, and I spent years in the school, when I was in the education department, we worried tremendously about the capacity of the DFE, as it now is, to handle 100 schools. 100 schools was the big... Could DFE ever manage centrally fund 100 schools was the big question. Well, we've got 4,250 and counting. I just don't think it's tenable that the funding of all of England's secondary and primary schools is going to continue indefinitely from a building up the road. I think it's nuts. And I think that will have to change at some point. And in relation to HE, where I totally agree with, I think, what Ryan said and what the report says, which is actually what the system of funding and student support we've got has worked much better than many predicted. So that's, in a way, a plus in terms of the record. But I worry in terms of what it means for the next Parliament. I think there'll be a lot of pressure for higher fees. I see very little prospect of higher fees being built onto the existing system, which is hugely expensive to the taxpayer, never mind the individual. So I think we're not well equipped for the next phase, if you like, of tuition fee policy with the status quo, and I don't really like any of the alternatives to the status quo either. So I think we're in a very difficult place on that one. They're all quite gloomy. I just want to say one word, because it doesn't get much for mention in the report, about something which I feel positive about in terms of the social policy plumbing. And we're in a much better position in 2015 than we were in 2010. And that is, and it doesn't sound very sexy, but workplace pensions is such a big deal. And this government has quietly gone about the business of delivering an auto-enrolment, reaching ever smaller employers. We're about to go through the next cohort. It's a very little publicity. It's been graphed from DWP. I mean, the contrast with other policies I could think of coming out of DWP is so sharp. But they have delivered largely on time. They've rolled out something which people said would not be possible. It's not going to solve all our problems, but it's going to make a very material difference to millions of working people. Lots of people said it would never be done. It's about to be done. And, it's happened it was conceived of under the last government, but has been seen through very successfully by this one, and they deserve full support for it, in my view. And they rarely get it, so it's very odd. In terms of just finishing, where does that leave me, and where does that leave my sort of assessment? Well, whoever wins is going to have both the long-term legacy problems of British social policy, English social policy, I should say, which are always with us in terms of vocational education and housing and so on. I could talk about. They're going to have a massive fiscal crunch, and they've got some faulty wiring to deal with, which I just think my final word would be that, and this is the kind of the policymaker, the Whitehall person in me, the stakes at the next spending review, which will happen this autumn, are so high. And it is so important that we don't just replay a 2015 version of the 2010 one, which basically came down to, different things, but it came down to a classic Whitehall, which department gets the biggest protections. In essence, it was who gets protected and who doesn't get protected so much. And I can understand why that happened in 2010. That absolutely can't be the defining question for the 2015 one. It has to be much harder spending review in the sense of it has to fit with what you're going to do in devolution, it has to fit with what you're going to do in the tax base, and it has to be a much bigger question than which departments are protected. It's got to be about which groups are you trying to reach and prioritise, regardless of which department budget the money flows through, which is a much harder thing to do, but that's what we have to do.
Gavin, thank you very much. Lots of really good insights there. We've got to, give them both of them a round of applause. Thank you. we've got 4 minutes left, and that's not a good idea to open up
sorry.
to lots and lots of questions. So what I'm going to do is just ask Ruth and John whether they'd like to come back in response to some of those very excellent points made by our two respondents, just to take us to the line. Could I just, ahead of that, ask a question about universal credit? I know I'm in territory where you have so much knowledge. Universal credit, which has been held back, but we think this is probably a step in the right direction. My conspiracy theory being that Treasury has not minded the delays because actually it costs more than the current system. But what are the prospects now of universal credit becoming a reality in the near future against the backdrop of the finances that we know to exist? So with that one as an extra, please could you respond to our two respondents?
Shall I go quickly first and then sum up? So, on universal credit, well, something called universal credit will happen. Already by October, 12,000 people were receiving it. That was a little short of the 2 million originally forecast. But actually, given the problems, given the ambitions of the reform, it was probably very good that it is only 12,000 people and it is coming in slowly. And if it hadn't been for the 2017 target, people might be applauding that. I think there are major challenges in universal credit. We may get a chance to talk about them later on. I think it will be on the desk of whoever is Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, assuming it is not the current incumbent, from whatever party, exactly which parts of universal credit to carry on with, whether to bring in council tax benefit or whether to go in a different direction and keep housing and council tax benefit out of it. And there are a whole series of design issues which are very difficult. So I imagine a first act of an incoming Secretary of State will be to commission a very rapid review. They will have at their hands a review which the Resolution Foundation are currently carrying out, which I hope will have all the answers in it, Gavin. One quick thing, one thing we didn't cover, a lot about the voluntary sector and things like SIBS and so on that Ryan mentioned. I would point people to the Big Society audit. I don't know whether any of its authors are in the audience, produced by, I think they're called Civil Society last week. Anyway, just Google Big Society audit, a comprehensive review of what has happened and a very gloomy review of what the outcome, in most respects, of the ambitions of the Big Society agenda. Not in all respects. There are, I seem to remember, 3 things in green as opposed to the 11 things in red in that report, but a more comprehensive assessment that we could give. I think there'll be a lot of discussion in the session Kitty Stewart is part of on childcare, and we'll say more about benefits in the session that Abigail and I are part of.
Okay, 3 quick things. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thanks for all the, that's not a quick thing, thanks for all those detailed points, but likewise I'm not going to pick up on those. But the 3 big things, Ryan's point about don't fixate on spending, right, it's not all about spending, but I think actually that line that it's nothing to do with outcomes and nothing to do with spending is also one that's put about really without, neither side has very well evidenced arguments around that. And actually I would point to our suite of reports on Labour's social policy, where I think with a body of a quite substantial evaluation, we were at that point able to point out what was the effect of spending on outcomes with the ability of hindsight. We haven't yet got what's the effect of withdrawal of spending on outcomes to the same degree of accuracy, but I think there is a need for more nuanced and well-evidenced argument about that, so that we don't get this kind of Mickey Mouse debate about we're fixating too much on spending, or if only we could increase spending, everything would be fine. The second point is to reinforce Ryan's point, no Tina. There are really big alternatives, and I think our reports really point to what those might be by setting out what's happened both under this government and the last. And the third one is really thanks, Gavin, for saying in 3 sentences what we were trying to say in 250,000 words. long-term legacy problems, massive fiscal crunch and faulty wiring, and that it's too crude to make departmental decisions. I think that's the biggest thing that comes out from my report. Whatever the social policies of the next government are, it needs much more kind of nuanced spending plans in order to be able to deliver them in a strategic way. So, Gavin, next time we try this, can you write the summary, please? The only thing remains for me to do, two things. Please, here are all the reports. Please go away, read them, use them, etc. For those of you that have to leave now, for those that you can stay, the breakout sessions, I meant to say employment, the government's record on employment and cash transfers. People who are staying for that breakout session, that will be in here in around about half an hour. The remaining breakout sessions are on the second floor. If you're going to the one on housing, health and social care, that's the room on the left on the second floor, the Princess Victoria room. We're disappointed about that because the Princess Victoria room is full of pictures of babies and young children. But the session on early years schools, which I will talk about, and further and higher education, is on the room on the right on the second floor, the Princess Elizabeth room. So I hope you can find yourselves there in about half an hour to hear more of mine.
Well, thank you all, and thanks to all of these authors for all of our 9 reports. Can we just conclude, I don't think we come together again, by thanking all those authors, but in particular thanking John and Ruth. Thank you all.